Did El Salvador, our beloved Bitcoin country, just renege on their promise to bring Bitcoin adoption into the meat space? Let's dive into it. So as you guys know, I've been relatively bearish on top-down adoption of Bitcoin. I've kind of in the past called the adoption in El Salvador a LARP. This was 2 or 3 years ago. I even today believe that Lightning, for the most part, is a bit of a LARP, or at least way, way, way overstated. Now, you guys also saw a few weeks ago, we did a video. I was in El Salvador, and I was pleasantly surprised. I saw Bitcoin adoption. I saw with my own eyes and with my kids and my mom and my wife, I saw and had the ability to actually go to a country and use Bitcoin as legal tender. Now, I had to use my fiat in some cases, but for the most part, I was able to live on Bitcoin. And all that was thanks to Bitcoin becoming legal tender in El Salvador. Basically, the government, Nayib Bukele, president-elect, comes into power and then decides that Bitcoin is legal tender in El Salvador. He decrees the law. He works with prominent Bitcoiners, Jack Mallers. He works with Max Kaiser, and they dream up what government Bitcoin adoption could and should look like for these developing nations. There we go, 8th of June, 2021. So at this point, it's been about 3.5 years since that law was in place. So in this law, again, passed about 3.5 years ago, it says, which is crazy, 70% of the population does not have access to traditional financial services. That's crazy. It's like 1% here in Canada. So that is absolutely mind-blowing. Later on, it goes to say that all prices can be expressed in Bitcoin. Tax contributions can be paid in Bitcoin. The key here is exchanges in Bitcoin will not be subject to capital gains tax like any other legal tender. This is pretty crazy. You know, accounting purposes, dollar can be used as the reference currency. So I think that all in all, they made massive steps with good, prominent Bitcoiners at their sides, kind of deciding what Bitcoin country could and should be. This was obviously loosely enforced. I'm not sure exactly how you force someone to take something other than what's been taken forever. Imagine, you know, coming in when credit cards were first announced and first kind of being invented and being like, all right, it's only credit cards from here on out. Payment infrastructure takes a while to change. And from my understanding, it got better. The Bitcoin infrastructure got better over the last 3 to 4 years. But then sometime last year, the IMF got their hands dirty. They started putting pressure on El Salvador to scale back Bitcoin dreams to seal a $1.3 billion IMF deal. This is basically just a loan. And interestingly enough, this was not to remove the Bitcoin from their balance sheet, but it was more so to remove it as legal tender in the world. So obviously, you know, we can all agree that Bitcoin is freedom money, and we can agree that anyone who opposes freedom money, like the IMF, is probably anti-freedom. The IMF does not want you to be free to use your money how you want, because if you can use your money how you want, they have infinitely less control over you, which would be approved by the IMF board, would seal the Central American country's return to the international financial fold after several years of relative isolation, following its passage of the law in June, making it the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. Basically, under the terms of the agreement, the country will no longer force businesses to adopt Bitcoin, to accept Bitcoin as payment. But notably, it will still be acceptable to accept Bitcoin as payment. It will be a voluntary approach to Bitcoin adoption. Personally, I'm bullish on this. I do not believe that we should have states, nation states, forcing Bitcoin adoption. It'll automatically be viewed as a negative thing. I love the grassroots approach. This is what, you know, you've seen me travel with Julian to Bitcoin Lake, to the Bitcoin jungle in Costa Rica, and then to El Salvador. All of them feel different. People in Vancouver are pumped when you pay in Bitcoin because it's been a grassroots adoption. People at Bitcoin Lake, you know, we had our problems in Guatemala, but for the most part, they were pumped when you paid in Bitcoin because they understood why it was important. If you force Bitcoin down people's throats, especially just to try to accelerate adoption, it's not always going to have the best outcome. It's kind of high time preference orange pilling. So Bukele has this thing now that the IMF wants, or at least wants him to get rid of. And he also has way, way, way more assets than there ever was in the past. They've still got their volcano mining. They've still got the Bitcoin in cold storage, real cold storage. Sailor, I'm talking to you. And they're forcing everyone to accept Bitcoin. But now, if he takes that away, he gets $1 billion. This seems like a pretty great move.
But apparently, El Salvador is to scale back their Bitcoin dreams to seal a deal with the IMF for $1.3 billion. And basically, The IMF is telling El Salvador that Bitcoin acceptance by businesses must be voluntary and not mandatory in order to unlock their $1.3 billion loan. So this is basic. If this is true, this is basically El Salvador kind of bending the knee to the IMF, which none of us want to see, unless it's a strategic move for long-term gain.
This is not a strategic move for long-term gain. Making Bitcoin acceptance mandatory and then not enforcing it was a strategic move. I think that Bukele all along wanted this $1 billion. He needed this $1 billion from the IMF, and him bending the knee. This is exactly what politicians are going to do forever. All of you Trump supporters, all of you LARPs that think the government is going to bring us into a Bitcoin standard are lying. You are kidding to yourselves, because politicians are incentivized to perform high time preference activity. Frankly, I think this is the lowest time preference activity we've ever seen from a president, making a risky move, bringing in Bitcoin adoption, making it mandatory, and then, building up all the clout inside the Bitcoiners. He knows the Bitcoiners are going to hate this. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care what you think. He wants $1 billion. He's going to get $1 billion and just say, oh, you mean the thing I've already not been enforcing now has to be voluntary? No problem. This is a no-brainer for a country that's developing in this way. This is going to give generations a future in El Salvador.
I don't know. I mean, maybe they're bending the knee to get $1.3 billion and they're going to invest in Bitcoin.
Oh my God. That would be the most heroic move. Make it voluntary, then take $1 billion and stack. That would be heroic. It's pretty hard for corrupt organizations to relinquish power over sovereign states. Too bad. Yeah, this is kind of the vibe, guys. Anytime we are excited about a politician doing something we think they're doing for us or for the betterment of us, they're not. We have to start seeing this by now. They are losing control. They use debt to enslave nations. Trouble is, they also assassinate those who don't play by the rules. Yeah? Although I think President Bukele probably knows how to protect himself in this environment, I do believe the IMF wants maximum control. Frankly, I'm a little surprised that they're letting it be voluntary acceptance in El Salvador. To be fair, I guess that's like every other nation in the world. But because this is such a big deal, it is quite interesting to me. They use debt to enslave nations. I mean, yeah, they're not. This comment is absolutely bang on.
So on El Salvador, IMF staff have ongoing engagement with the Salvadorian authorities, and the objective is to reach agreement on a new IMF-supported program, help with macroeconomic stabilization and adjustment, and also growth-enhancing reforms. Ongoing discussions are focused on policies to strengthen reforms that can be used to boost productivity and economic governance.
Ooh, boosting economic governance sounds like a Cobra effect waiting to happen.
Addressing risks arising from Bitcoin is a key element of these discussions.
Here's probably, in my mind, how this plays out. Step one, make accepting Bitcoin not mandatory, a little bit more voluntary. All that, again, like I said, is fine. But give them a taste. Give them the $1 billion. Let them know what the free money tastes like. Step two is going to be either making that very, very difficult with, within this governance program, giving them some weird accounting rules, or, hey, by the way, we don't like the fact that you have Bitcoin on your balance sheet. You have to sell some of that. No country that we're giving loans to is going to have the ability to have more than X% of their liabilities, X% of their assets held in this volatile industry that we don't like.
And of course, the goal is for the fund to be in a position to support a credible and well-sequenced policy package that is designed by the authorities. With respect to the details on Bitcoin, what we have recommended is a narrowing of the scope of the Bitcoin law, strengthening the regulatory framework and oversight of the Bitcoin ecosystem.
This is super fascinating. So already El Salvador is pretty difficult for companies like us to do business in El Salvador. I have investigated what it would be like to offer fiat rails in El Salvador, basically bringing the Bitcoin Well platform to the Salvadorians there. And very, very difficult to do so. I think that, with 70% of the population not having access to a bank, that's wild. Maybe it wouldn't work, but it's already very centralized, already very subsidized by the government. And so it's going to be interesting to see what these stricter regulations might look like and how it makes Bitcoin adoption more, but probably less friendly down there.
And limiting the public sector exposure to Bitcoin.
Sounds like the carrot approach. Maybe the stick approach didn't work. We're not going to give you any loans. No problem. I'll just hodl my Bitcoin. Here's a little bit of money. If you want a little bit more, maybe you can just get rid of some of that Bitcoin, some of that fake internet money that's only for drug dealers and money launderers. This is the vibe that I'm getting from this year. Again, with the guys, I really don't. There's more at play here. I really don't think he's gonna just ape into Bitcoin with the loan, but that would be pretty epic. Making Bitcoin optional for business instead of compulsory seems not to be a bad thing. I totally agree. It actually sits well with the ethos of Bitcoin that it is a voluntary network. Again, I totally agree. I think this was chess on Bukele's part 3 years ago. Make it mandatory. Give them something that's easy to take away. Give them something. Give them a win. To design the framework in order to say, okay, I concede, it's voluntary, totally fine. The bigger thing at play here is whether or not the IMF is playing chess on the other side, saying, here's a little bit of cash, but you got to sell some Bitcoin to get more cash, and you got to sell more Bitcoin. And just like that, Bukele, El Salvador is all of a sudden less sovereign than it's ever been, with more money and more debt. But all these comments, all of this stuff, it begs the question, can you force a Bitcoin adoption? Is this on the macro for Bitcoiners, for you and I that want to live on a Bitcoin standard and be a part of a sovereign nation that has adopted a Bitcoin standard? Is this the way to do it? Can we have a government coming down and decreeing this stuff that we all think is a positive thing? Or is it better to have a grassroots movement that ultimately lifts it up because it wants to be there? Bitcoin is difficult to accept. I've seen that. I've experienced that. It's tough to run a Lightning node. Sometimes the custodians don't always work. It's not a simple process. However, when you want to be there, when you understand that Bitcoin is for freedom, when you understand the generational importance of adopting a Bitcoin standard, you're willing to do the work. I have been shuffling around and balancing nodes and seed phrase and seed plates and hardware wallets and testing different things out and using different wallets and shifting it all around because I enjoy it, because I understand the importance of what the security of my Bitcoin is going to be. I understand that it's important to go down to Costa Rica in the Bitcoin jungle and spend my Bitcoin. I understand that when a coffee shop in Vancouver takes Bitcoin, you better believe I'm going to be using it, because that's how you get the economy to thrive. That's how we get more and more and more people accepting and excited about the freedom that Bitcoin brings, not just number go up price through an ETF. So I think this is the IMF taking a pawn from El Salvador. Making Bitcoin voluntary to accept I'm bullish on that. That is the way that it should be for every nation. However, they now have the knights in scope. They are now positioning themselves, this $1 billion that they've got dangling over El Salvador's head, they now have the knights in scope. They're laying the stage, laying the groundwork to make El Salvador less sovereign with more debt. But don't let me dictate this. What do you think? Do you think that the government of El Salvador, that Nayib Bukele, is this a good thing that they're doing, that they're bending the knee to the IMF, making this voluntary? Or are you, like me in my camp, kind of maybe a little bit cautious about getting into bed? This feels like it could be a deal from the devil from my perspective. Tell me if I'm right. Tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me what I missed. Ultimately, do you think that amending the Bitcoin law is taking away or giving power to Salvadorian citizens? That's it for me. Let me know what you would want to see, how you envision hyper-Bitcoinization. Like, subscribe, and all the good stuff. My name's Adam. Stay sovereign.